As a church here in Aspley, you've been exploring these I ams together, and you've thought about how Jesus saying I am roots him and puts him alongside the God who spoke to Moses and said, I am who I am. And so in these phrases that maybe for some of us who have grown up in churches, we could list all 7 without thinking. But as we look at this one this morning, we're going to think again about what it means for us. Martin hasn't quite stolen all my best points, but he's stolen a couple, and that's fine. Because actually, it's just God reminding us of the importance of these things. And so last week, John looked with you at I am the light of the world, and about the direction that Jesus gives and brings to those who follow him. And as we look at John 10, we see Jesus. Well, you get a 2-for-1. You get I am the good shepherd and I am the gate. But we're only going to look at I am the good shepherd this morning. And as we look at it, it's important to understand and see where it comes into context. So if you've got your Bibles open or you've got your apps on your phone, you can flick or swipe accordingly to John chapter 9. So this is where the story begins for this particular moment. And so Jesus heals a man born blind. And you'd think this is great news, that everyone would be ecstatic that someone who is born blind can now see. But then the Pharisees start to investigate, start to wonder about why and how. And they discover that this man who was born blind was healed on the Sabbath. So on the holy day, on the day that the Jewish people had set aside as only being for God. And so there's a kind of little small claims court that goes on. The Pharisees bring in the man born blind, say, what happened? Who was it that did this to you? But the man is living in fear out of what he says, because the people in authority, the Pharisees, could excommunicate him from their society. And so they don't really get anywhere with the man who says it was Jesus. And then they bring in his parents and say, is this man your son, and was he born blind? And again, they are fearful about what to say, because these people, these Pharisees in charge of the people of Israel, they have the power to excommunicate. They have the power to push people outside of their community. And so again, they say, our son's old enough to speak for himself. And so the son comes back and is boldly proclaims that it was Jesus. And, who has ever heard of someone healing someone who was born blind? Jesus gets wind of what's going on, that people aren't happy about this healing, and he goes to the man and affirms to him who he is. And then, so at the end of chapter 9, you'll see that some Pharisees who were with him heard him say this, so heard him say, for judgment I have come into this world, so that the blind will see, and those who will see will become blind. So some Pharisees then say, what? Are we blind too? Jesus says, if you were blind, you would not be guilty of sin. But now that you claim you can see, your guilt remains. I tell you the truth. The man who does not enter the sheep pen by the gate, but climbs in by some other way, is a thief and a robber. And so this gets us into the passage that Diane read for us. And so as Jesus says, I am the good shepherd, it's in response to this situation, the leaders amongst the people of Israel not being happy about the healing of someone born blind on a Sabbath. So I want you to hold that in mind as we go through and as we look at some of the things Jesus said. And as Martin has already sort of spoken to us about, when we think shepherds, what comes to mind? Is it the child in the nativity with a tea towel on their heads? Or is it something akin to One Man and His Dog? So an old withered man with a shepherd's crook and a barber jacket, a flat cap, and a 4x4 behind him, whistling, saying, come by, to his sheepdog to get the sheep around? Or is it the Yorkshire shepherdess that was featured in programs like Yorkshire Farm and The Dales and things like that? What comes to mind for you? Because what would have come to mind for the the people that Jesus was speaking to, in part, what would have come to mind would have been the example of someone like David that we read about in the Old Testament in 1 Samuel 16. So when Samuel goes to find the new king, who we're told is one of Jesse's sons, he goes to see Jesse, and Jesse says, oh yeah, it'll be this one, it'll be my firstborn. And there's this kind of, not quite a talent show, but the brothers all come forward, and God says to Samuel, it's not that one, they're not the next king. And then almost to the point of thinking, Jesse thinking he's got no more sons, Samuel says, is there anybody else? Oh yeah, there's Dave. Oh, it's the youngest one, David. He's just out looking after the sheep in the fields. And so David's then brought in and said, yeah, God says this is the man who I want to be king. And you'll, if not know the story of David and Goliath, heard of that phrase of David versus Goliath. And in that moment, David describes what it's like to be a shepherd. He boldly claims that he can defeat Goliath, and when King Saul says how, David tells him this, that when I was a shepherd, so in 1 Samuel 17, here we go, in verse 35, your servant has been keeping his father's sheep. When a lion or a bear came and carried off a sheep from the flock, I went after it, struck it, and rescued the sheep from its mouth. When it turned on me, I seized it by its hair, struck it, and killed it. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, because he has defied the armies of the living God. The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of the Philistine. And so our imagery of what a shepherd is like is actually, maybe we need to reframe that to think actually a shepherd's job is a job of danger and of risk, but of bravery, isn't it? Did you hear what David said? So when the bear or lion takes the sheep, he doesn't run away, he runs towards the danger and retrieves the sheep. And this speaks of another story that Jesus tells about the lost sheep and how the shepherd goes after the lost sheep. And so again, it's a story of danger, of risk, of looking out for individuals. And so this kind of shepherd is the one that the people at the time of Jesus would have thought about. In our Christmas stories, with the shepherds with the tea towels on their head, you know, they were the first to hear the good news of Jesus. And for those of you who know things about history, it was a lower social class to be a shepherd. Because where did you spend all your time? Out in the fields. Who did you spend all your time with? Sheep. So you would have been muddy, you would have been smelly, you would have been lonely, and yet God chose those shepherds to be the first to say, today in the town of David, a Saviour has been born. And so that's part of the imagery for Jesus when he says, I am the good shepherd. So he identifies himself with the lowest in society. And not just with the lowest, but with the bravest as well. To say that I am a good shepherd who goes after the sheep. I lay down my life. And this shepherd, this term for the people of Israel, was also closely linked to their leaders. So you can flick or turn to Numbers 27. So this is Moses preparing for his succession. So when he will hand over the leadership of the people of Israel. And in Numbers 27 and verse 16, Moses prays this to God. May the Lord, the God of the spirits of all mankind, appoint a man over this community to go out and come in before them, one who will lead them out and bring them in, so that the Lord's people will not be like sheep without a shepherd. And in Ezekiel chapter 34, that we'll look at in more depth later, again, the people of Israel are talked about as sheep and who need a good shepherd. Israel had been a nomadic people from the very beginning. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. You know, they'd had sheep, they'd moved around, they'd been in motion, never static, never staying still. As part of their rich heritage. And so when Jesus comes to the Pharisees who are questioning the healing of a man born blind on the Sabbath, he's looking at the shepherds. He's looking at the people in authority over that community, the ones who are meant to be looking after them. And rather than being joyful and delighted that a man born blind has been healed, they take, umbrage at the fact that it happened on the Sabbath. A wiser person than me, a friend of ours called Roger, told us that the Pharisees, they knew the letter of the law, but they didn't know the spirit of the law. And so that's why the keeping of the Sabbath, that's to be kept, and we keep it holy. But actually, Jesus, when he talks about being the Lord of the Sabbath, and saying the Sabbath was made for man, not the other way round. And so they've made a mistake. And Jesus says to them as shepherds. And so that's why when we read this whole passage, as Diane has done for us today, there are stinging rebukes here. I tell you the truth, the man who does not enter the sheep pen by the gate, but climbs in by some other way, is a thief and a robber. The man who enters by the gate is the shepherd of his sheep. The watchman opens the gate for him, and the sheep listens to his voice. Later on in verse 5, they will never follow a stranger. In fact, they will run away from him because they do not recognize a stranger's voice. Jesus used this figure of speech, but they didn't understand what he was telling them. It seemed clear to us, doesn't it? We read this and think, he's talking to you, and he's saying that you're not a good shepherd, you're not the shepherd, you're thieves, robbers, you're strangers, because actually you're not telling them the things of God that are in the Old Testament. And you're faced by someone who's doing the things of God, and you're challenging him. You're saying, this isn't right. What has happened is wrong. And Jesus really rams that home later on. And so you can look, I won't read all of it, from verse 7 to 10. He talks about the thieves and robbers again. Jesus says, I am the gate. So you kind of get all these mixed metaphors here. But I am the gate. So you have to go through him. And so those who are trying to go through other ways, hopping over the fences, using the law of the Lord for their own means rather than for the revelation of who Jesus was, they're the thieves, they're the robbers, they're the strangers who are leading the sheep astray. And Jesus says, I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. I'm about to split the room in just admitting, and some of you already know this, that I support Notts County. And yesterday I took Grace, so my daughter Grace, to the football for the first time at Meadow Lane. And for any of you who have been to Meadow Lane, you'll know that when you say to someone that I'll meet you at the tree, you know where that tree is. And there's a little murmur, maybe some of you know. If you don't know the tree at Meadow Lane, then I'd encourage you to go and find it. Even as Grace, I told her about this tradition that would meet Uncle Mark by the tree. She turned a corner and said, is that the tree? And it's so impressive and big that it's like, yes, Grace, that's the tree. And so when Jesus says, I am the good shepherd, it's not I am a good shepherd. It's not that I am one of the good shepherds. It's I am the good shepherd. And that's the same for all of these I ams that you've looked at. I am the light of the world. I am the good shepherd. I am the bread of life. It's categorical. It's nobody else but me. And maybe at times we struggle with that, don't we? Or maybe your friends struggle with that. Do you really believe it's just this person? Just this one man? All of these things, all of the means of salvation, the only one I should follow? And it seems arrogant, doesn't it, to say, well, actually, yeah, I do believe that. I do believe that he's the one, that he's the resurrection and the life. But actually, it would only be arrogant if it wasn't true for who he was and what he did. Because actually we see that in his life, and when we take communion later, we'll remember it again. About it wasn't just words that Jesus said, but it was the actions. And so here, when Jesus says, and the good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep, it tells us of the cross. It tells us of the one who would go and lay down his life for his sheep. And within this passage, we've heard that it's not just the sheep, the people of Israel, but Jesus said, I have sheep in another fold. So I have sheep in another fold, so outside of the Jewish community, into the Gentiles, so those who are not born into this family, this Jewish faith. And actually, they're going to be one flock. They're going to become one flock with one shepherd. And that shepherd is Jesus, and we, Jews, Gentiles, from every background, every walk of life, are part of that one flock. Because Jesus laid down his life, his body was broken, and his blood was shed, so that all could come to be part of that one flock. And so I'm just going to do some of these, a little whistle stop between sort of what this shepherd is like. So we've heard that he's laid down his life for sheep, so it's something of his character. But kind of what about for us as sheep? So if Jesus is the good shepherd, then we are the sheep. And so what do we need to do? So if you just look quickly at verse 3, we get several things here. So in verse 3 of chapter 10, the watchman opens the gate for the shepherd, and the sheep listen to his voice. He calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. So the sheep listen. They listen to his voice. They know his voice. So my sheep, he calls his own sheep by name. So there's a personal relationship there, each one by name, and he leads them out. So he's someone that we follow, and John thought about that last week. So being the direction. So Jesus gives us direction in life and in circumstance, in dilemma, in problem, in celebration. Jesus leads us. And so we see in verse 9 that this is, again, it's sort of on the move. I am the gate. Whoever enters through me will be saved. He will come in and go out and find pasture. So there's movement here, isn't there? Maybe when we think about being secure, about having a good leader, about being in a place of security, it's like it's batten down the hatches, the biggest sheepfold, the biggest wall, nobody can get in. But Jesus says the security is actually in the going in and the coming out and finding new pasture. So the security isn't in the walls that Jesus is saying are going to be built, but it's in the presence of the person, the presence of the shepherd who knows us by name, who tells us, this is the way, walk in it. I don't know anything about shepherds or sheep, really, but I've been through enough farms and seen enough farmers, shepherds with sheep. They don't give them real instructions, do they? They don't stand there and say, okay, this sheep, sheep number 1, can you just move there and just get sheep number 2, and then you just follow here. And if you could all just get in a line, it's just one call, isn't it? It's telling the sheepdog, whistling and doing things and come by. And in here, Jesus says it's not the instructions. I know them by name. And so at times, it's just the call of the name, isn't it? And at times, the call of the name isn't always to come here and go in this direction. I imagine all of us have spent, at some point in our lives, time in the dark. And maybe you spent time in the dark with someone that you know. And actually, when they call your name or say, I'm here, suddenly you feel more secure. Oh, I'm not on my own. Oh, I'll follow their voice and I'll be with them. So whatever your circumstances today, whether you're in difficulty, whether you are celebrating, whether you're wondering even why you're sat here, Jesus is calling you by name. And maybe we want the whole plan, we want the whole detail. And actually, Jesus, if you could just give me the whole plan and the whole detail, that'd really help me out. In my experience, that's almost never been the case in my life, of the whole plan and the whole detail. But more commonly, it's been the name, Nathan. I'm with you. Keep going. And that's maybe not enough. But actually, the presence of our good shepherd should be enough. I'm challenged by these verses here where it talks about how the sheep, they ignore the stranger's voice and they only listen to the good shepherd. And I'm challenged by that personally because I think, am I so in tune with Jesus that when there's a stranger's voice, I just ignore it? Or I just think, no, I'm not going to. There's a massive thing these days, it makes me sound incredibly old, noise-cancelling headphones, meaning that you can only hear what is coming through your phone or your streaming service, whatever. I can hear nothing else but that. And again, maybe you've had this situation, I have, and maybe it's just the company that I keep. I see a friend on the street and I don't notice that they've got their earpods in or whatever, and I call them by name, and I'm loud, and they just blank me and ignore me and keep going. Again, it might just be me. But as they keep going, then I see the headphones, I think, oh yeah, they're listening to something, they're on a podcast or music or whatever. Are we so in tune with Jesus that even when other people call our name, we ignore them? I can't honestly say that is me all the time. But I'm listening for when Jesus does call my name to respond and to follow and to go, because he is the good shepherd. And so we listen, we're known by him, he leads us, he's our presence as we come and go on adventure of faith. And it's not just his words. And this, in verse 11, when we read that the good shepherd lays down his life for his sheep, we think, yes. And because Jesus was who he said he was, because he laid down his life for his sheep. And again, he enlightens this by what comes later. So if you look down at verse 14, I'm the good shepherd, I know my sheep, and my sheep know me. And as the Father knows me, I know the Father, and I lay down my life for the sheep. I have other sheep that are not of the sheep pen, I must bring them also. They too will listen to my voice, and there shall be one flock and one shepherd. The reason my Father loves me is that I lay down my life only to take it up again. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down of my own accord. I have authority to lay it down and authority to take it up. This command I received from my Father. So do you see here how he then alludes to it, doesn't he? This command I've received from my Father. Like, what's he talking about? And again, I imagine the Pharisees, the disciples, whoever, like, what is he talking about? I have no idea. And then John's writing his gospel one day, inspired by the Holy Spirit to do it. And then he thinks, oh yeah, this was the command that Jesus was given, that he would lay down his life and he would take it up again, that he would die, but that he would rise again. And that was the command that his Father gave him, that you will die, but you'll rise again to bring people to new life. This good shepherd, the one that we should follow, the one that we should listen to, the one that not only knows us, but that we want to get to know, so that then when we hear his voice, we can respond in the right way, respond to his promptings. And so I'm going to finish in some ways in a strange way by reading from Ezekiel 34. And so this is a 600 years before Christ or thereabouts. And in this, Ezekiel is prophesying both to the now of the people of Israel, but as to what is to come. And I'm not really going to say much because, as is often the case with the Bible, is that it speaks for itself. And so as I read this to you, in the first part, unfortunately, think of the Pharisees in John 9 and John 10. And in the second half, at the turning point, think of Jesus. So Ezekiel chapter 34. The word of the Lord came to me, Son of man, prophesy against the shepherds of Israel. Prophesy and say to them, this is what the sovereign Lord says. Woe to the shepherds of Israel who only take care of themselves. Should not shepherds take care of the flock? You eat the curds, clothe yourselves with the wool, and slaughter the choice animals, but you do not take care of the flock. You've not strengthened the weak, or healed the sick, or bound up the injured. You have not brought back the strays, or searched for the lost. You have ruled them harshly and brutally. So they were scattered, because there was no shepherd. And when they were scattered, they became food for all the wild animals. My sheep wandered over all the hills, over all the mountains, and over every high hill. They were scattered over the whole earth, and no one searched or looked for them. Therefore, you shepherds, hear the word of the Lord. As surely as I live, declares the sovereign Lord, because my flock lacks a shepherd, and so has been plundered and become food for all the wild animals. And because my shepherds did not search for my flock, but cared for themselves rather than for my flock, therefore, O shepherds, hear the word of the Lord. This is what I say. I am against the shepherds and will hold them accountable for my flock. I will remove them from the tending the flock, that the shepherds can no longer feed themselves. I will rescue my flock from their mouths, and it will no longer be food for them. For this is what the sovereign Lord says. I myself will search for my sheep and look after them. As a shepherd looks after his scattered flock when he is with them, so will I look after my sheep. I will rescue them from the places where they were scattered on a day of clouds and darkness. I will bring them out from the nations and gather them from the countries, and I will bring them into their own land. I will pasture them on the mountains of Israel, in the ravines, and in all the settlements in the land. I will tend them in a good pasture, and the mountain heights of Israel will be their grazing land. There they will lie down in good grazing land, and they will feed in a rich pasture on the mountain of Israel. I myself will tend my sheep and make them lie down, declares the sovereign Lord. I will search for the lost and bring back the strays. I will bind up the injured and strengthen the weak. But the sleek and the strong I will destroy. I will shepherd the flock with justice. In a moment, we'll take communion together. And before that, we'll sing the song, Who You Say I Am. And so in this song, the chorus reveals that I'm a child of God. Yes, I am. And so for us, for you this morning, whether you've accepted Christ's sort of parenthood, God's parenthood over you or not, Jesus is the good shepherd. And you know, he's still looking for the lost sheep. And he's still binding up those that are broken. And he's still searching for the ones that are lost. And so whether you feel, whether you're literally lost and you've come into this building and you're wondering where you are, or whether you're metaphorically lost, or you're lost in a situation that is hurting you, Jesus is looking for you. There's another song called The Reckless Love of God, where it sings the parable of the lost sheep. And in that, we are those sheep. And Jesus fights for us, and he searches for us. And so as we prepare for communion and remember that Jesus died, we remember he did that willingly, that he laid down his life, and that he took it up again to give life. And that life is in the family of God. And so as we sing, we're children of God. We want to embrace that. This, again, Mike Pilavachi from Soul Survivor describes this as the family meal of God. So I don't know what your family meal is. I don't know what, when guests come round, what you put on, what's your specialty. But this is God's family meal. And as Martin said, it's for those who know and love the Lord. And just to say, at the first institution of the Lord's Supper, there were some around that table who knew, loved, disobeyed, and left the Lord as well. And so this family meal, whether you take it this morning, this is for everyone. So if you're questioning whether you know and love the Lord, or you're struggling with it, the meal is for you. The table is open. So let's stand and sing together, Who You Say I Am, and remember that we are who God says we are because of what Jesus has done for us in laying down his life and taking it up again for us.